So Gen Y and Millennials. I only recently learned that these were the same group of people. So maybe shame on me, maybe I'm not entirely alone. But these are the folks who were born between 1982 and 1995, a little bit younger than some of us. And they are considered the first postmodern generation. And they're also understood to hold a distinct worldview. Feelings are paramount over reason, and right, wrong, and truth are considered all relative terms. They also make, though, for web-savvy jurors who expect to get information immediately and become frustrated with laborious trial presentations. They rely more on visual communication and storytelling approaches. Trial lawyer Jen Mountcastle will discuss the mindset of a millennial juror and strategies for communicating on their wavelength. Please welcome Jen Mountcastle.
Good morning. So my topic is the millennial juror, and I hope to accomplish three things this morning. First, explain what a millennial is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term. Second, describe some of the defining characteristics of the generation so that you can take that information into account when deciding whether a millennial might be right for your next jury trial. And third, to provide some tips on both voir dire and trial presentation so that you stand the best chance of winning a millennial over to your side of the case. So first, who are the millennials? There's not universal agreement on exactly what the date cutoffs are for the generations. I've seen all the way back to 1980, which is where the Pew Research Center dates it. You can see it all the way into the mid-'80s. And the end point has been dated as early as 1995 and as late as the mid-2000s. So in general, it's going to be people who are between the ages of around 32 and are teenagers today. And they've been referred to by a number of other terms. Generation Y was a pretty popular one early on before they really had an identity because it followed Generation X. You see some of the others here as well. I'm personally partial to the boomerang generation because it actually provides you with some information about the generation. First, that their parents are primarily baby boomers. And secondly, they leave and then come home to their boomer parents because of the economic conditions they have aged into. So let's play a little game. Which generation do you belong to? Take a look there and see if you recognize any of these movies, if they're familiar to you. If you haven't figured it out already, I am not a millennial, although I have been mistaken for one from time to time. In fact, my favorite movie is The Breakfast Club. And one more, here's some popular toys for a variety of generations. See if you can find the toys that you used to play with when you were a child. Again, if you haven't figured it out for me yet, I had and still have 4 Cabbage Patch Kids. So let's talk about some numbers. This is a pretty striking piece of data, a couple years outdated. So there's 2 things to appreciate here, aside from the cartoon. The millennial generation, as of a couple years ago, had about 76 million people who were adults. If you date the millennials all the way into the early 2000s, that group is still growing. On the other hand, boomers and Gen X, those generations are closed. So those are going to continue to decline in number. Millennials are going to increase, which means this is going to be the largest generation we have experienced yet. And so indeed, the millennials will be coming to a jury near you. So now I'd like to show you a video about the millennial generation made by the preeminent experts on the topic.
I'm a millennial.
I'm a millennial.
I'm a millennial.
I'm a millennial, and I'm sorry.
And I'm sorry.
We suck, and we know it.
We're self-centered. We're entitled. We're narcissistic, lazy, and immature.
And we're super sorry about that.
We're the worst. If only we could be more like our parents.
Yeah, the baby boomers. You guys were great.
He gave us great music.
60s counterculture.
Psychedelic drugs.
A lot of great movies, too.
Jurassic Park was awesome. Good job with that one.
We don't know what happened. You raised us to believe that we were special.
So special that we didn't even have to do anything to earn it.
I got this trophy for existing in soccer.
That's pretty special.
No idea what went wrong.
You tried your best. You insisted we all go to college, and now we're the most educated generation in American history.
Sure, college costs 600% more than it did when you went, and yes, we averaged like $30,000 in student loan debt.
But here we go again, making excuses. We're so lazy.
Instead of living in our parents' basements and waiting tables, we should just go and get real jobs, like you did.
I mean, not a job in manufacturing since those all got outsourced in the 90s.
Man, the 90s were great. Do you guys remember Full House? It's a good show.
We graduated into a recession, and 90% of the jobs created since 2009 are part-time. But let's be honest, we just don't like hard work.
Hey, what was the deal with that recession anyway?
I think it had something to do with the housing bubble that started in the 90s. I don't know, I was still pretty young back then.
Oh, and we're really sorry about messing up those 2 wars you guys started. Sorry so many of our friends died.
We just can't do anything right.
We're really sorry we suck so much.
I mean, it's not like we jacked up college tuition prices or
Destroyed the manufacturing industry.
Started 2 quagmire wars.
gutted the unions.
Destroyed the global economy.
And left our offspring with an environmentally devastated planet stripped of its natural resources.
Man, it'd be crazy if there was a generation that recklessly awful, huh?
But we do text too much. Ugh.
I know, right?
So on behalf of all the millennials, we'd like to apologize for being so terrible. From now on, we're going to be just like the baby boomers.
Because you guys, you nailed it.
So that video is on YouTube, and the credits are really hilarious. There's actually about 30 more seconds of credits. There's some good content there too, and it is called Millennials, We Suck and We're Sorry. So just a few more numbers about millennials. They are considered the most liberal, the most diverse, and the least religious generation so far. Interestingly enough, they were credited largely with sweeping up Barack Obama into the Oval Office in 2008. Unemployment is a real hallmark of this generation because of the economic times when they aged into the workforce. And as mentioned in the video, they are on track to become the most educated generation in American history. And incidentally, Pew Research Center has a lot of great materials on the millennials and a lot of generational research information that's available online if you want to read up more on this topic. So here are some of the key life events in evaluating individuals who might come into your jury box and the worldview that they bring and the biases that they bring. These are the formative events for millennials: school violence, corporate and personal scandals, the financial crisis, 9/11, and of course the rise of the internet, which is what gives rise to one of the real hallmark characteristics of this generation. They're considered to be the digital natives. There was a survey done, Pew actually did it, of various people from various generations and what they considered to be the top 5 characteristics that their generation should be known for. And the millennials' top choice was 24% said technology. That was what made their generation unique. They also included clothes and music too, so they've got some really good priorities. Whereas us Xers and Boomers, one of our top 5 was hard work. So. But in any event, on the rest of these numbers, I think these are actually getting outdated. Again, these are from 2010. I've seen numbers this week that show that participation in social networking is actually over 90% for millennials. And for those of you who have millennials at home, you ought to go home and check out what kind of videos they're posting of themselves online, because 1 in 5 of them have done so. So now I get into the stereotyping, and I'll give my disclaimer here. I by no means believe that everyone of a given generation holds all the same beliefs. We're all unique and there are a number of factors that influence the biases and the worldviews that we hold. But that being said, there is a fair amount of agreement that there are hallmark generational characteristics for each generation, and it's because they've come of age during a time when they've had shared events that have been very formative in their worldviews. So wanted to pick out a couple of these to talk about in particular. Narcissism, entitlement, laziness. Again, these were covered in the video. Considering themselves the authority. As Morpheus tells us down in the corner, though, these may very well be more attributable to youth than to a particular generational characteristic. Hasn't this really been said about everybody who's young, right? They believe the world revolves around them, they're naive, they don't really understand yet the way the world works. But that being said, there is believed to be some truth behind some of these characteristics. On narcissism and entitlement, what the social scientists say is that this may be an outgrowth of the fact that there was a very heavy very heavy focus in the 80s and the 90s with children in instilling self-confidence, that this was a very strong focus in the educational system at the time. And hence, you have everybody wins trophies, everybody's special, we all win. And perhaps some of that was a little bit overboard. And as a result, we've created some monsters in the sense of an overinflated sense of self. And considering themselves the authority. This may very well be derived from the fact that they are the most educated generation so far, and that we are increasingly moving to a technology-driven economy where they have the upper hand. And so their view is that their youth and their experience with technology is more of an asset than age and experience are, and so therefore they do see themselves as much more of an authority than you would expect someone who's relatively young. Skipping forward to a couple more, I find the third bullet point pretty fascinating, and if you're really interested in sort of generational philosophy, embracing the system. This generation, more than predecessor generations, really embraces the role of government, whereas prior generations were much more rebellious, skeptical of the government. They are not as much so. They do see the government playing an important role and embrace the government system. I have to get a gender jab in. I'll skip to the last one. This question has been posed by a number of social scientists. Are women the new men? The millennial generation, in the millennial generation, women seem to be outperforming the men, both in schooling and in the workforce in terms of meeting income and finding jobs in a more difficult economy. So I find that a pretty interesting factor when you're evaluating your jury pool. So what does this all mean? And again, I'm by no means going to try to predict what every millennial's views are going to be if you have them in a jury box. But there are some factors here that would seem to indicate that millennials are pro-plaintiff, being liberal and being proudly liberal. In my world, where I spend a lot of time representing corporations from claims by individuals, both personal injury and consumer claims, Democratic-leaning jurors tend to be disfavored by my clients, and we tend to focus more upon those who are more conservative because they tend to be more pro-business. The focus on fairness, does that translate into a focus on feelings over facts and being susceptible to the emotional ploys of plaintiff's counsel rather than facts and reason? And then because they've experienced such high unemployment, millennials have a tendency to relate better to those who are out of work due to no perceived fault of their own. So does that make them a more plaintiff jury pool? That being said, there are plenty of factors that also indicate that they have a tendency to be pro-defense because they're highly educated. In my practice, where I defend a lot of product liability claims, I need people who are going to be smart enough to understand the complicated products that my clients make, to understand how businesses work. So in fact, many commentators consider millennials to actually be pro-business. They're not nearly as distrustful of corporations as prior generations, which I find fascinating given that they grew up in an era of corporate scandals. Corporate transparency is important to them. So jumping ahead a little bit, as one of your trial themes, being transparent in presenting your case about the inner workings of your corporation may very well go a long way, since that is something that they value, in order to reinforce that they tend to be a little bit more trustful of corporations. And one of the reasons for that may very well be, or two of the reasons may be, that they tend to be pretty resourceful and entrepreneurial themselves, and they like that businesses create things that they like. They're heavy consumers, and they're smart enough to appreciate that businesses aren't the bad guy. They're actually made up of people like themselves who come up with things that they like to have and like to play with. And then interestingly, the high narcissism factor has actually been attributed to a lack of empathy. So rather than being susceptible to the emotional ploys, they may very well not be empathetic to that at all. They're a more reserved, less passionate, more removed group of people, and therefore don't necessarily buy into the highly emotional ploys of plaintiff's counsel. So some jury consultants are coming out and saying that their take is that millennials can be more defense-oriented. They're seeing millennials really question why a plaintiff didn't get a second opinion, to question why what plaintiffs may have done in order to contribute to their situation, which means they may very well end up being a much more pro-defense group than we might initially think. So a couple of voir dire tips for millennials. First and foremost, take advantage of online information. Optimally, if you can do it within the confines of the court's requirements of you, if you can have a member of your trial team who can be online during voir dire, you can get information from the jurors, the prospective jurors, about whether they write blogs or contribute to any particular web pages, and you can pull those up and evaluate them while you're in the process of picking your jury. If you get information on your veneer pool in advance and you can do that research in advance, great. But you also can do it real time if you plan ahead and have someone from your team devoted to doing research on your jurors as you're voir diring the jury, and then continuing to rely upon that information throughout the trial in order to tailor your presentation to hopefully be one that they are accepting of. Starting a conversation, less talking and more listening. So a voir dire approach that's more conversational is going to be much more likely to appeal to a millennial for two reasons. First, they like to talk and they think what they have to say is very important, more so than what you may have to say. So you're going to really kill two birds with one stone with considering a more conversational type of voir dire. You're going to feed the narcissism and the fact that they want to be heard and their opinions want to be heard, but you're also going to build rapport with them to show that you respect and are interested in their opinions. And it allows you to gather the information that you're really looking for. What are these people's views so that you can understand what their biases or leanings are going to be? And avoiding interrogating. If you have any millennials at home, you've probably experienced this. They're much more likely to provide you with the information that you're looking for if you're not deposing them. So a couple trial tips for millennials. If it hasn't become patently obvious already from the earlier parts of this presentation, you've got to embrace technology and multimedia. And that really is true, quite frankly, for all people in the jury box. And as this program over the last 2 days has evidenced, it's much more entertaining and interesting when there's something interactive, entertaining, there's storytelling, videos. That's what they need to see. And we all need to see it, but in particular, that is how this generation has grown up. Speaking in sound bites. Remember, these are people that are used to getting their information in 140 characters or less on instant messaging and Twitter and Facebook. You've got to boil it down to the most important concepts. Streamlining your case presentation. This is the ADD generation, attention deficit disorder. That's when it became popular, that diagnosis in the 80s and 90s, and it was really this generation that was on the leading edge of that. There's no better evidence of this than how cartoons have changed. And I have young children at home, so I spend a lot more time than I should watching cartoons. I grew up on Bugs Bunny, and if you look at how the old Bugs Bunny cartoons were designed, they were much more methodical and deliberate approach to setting up the punchline. The scenes didn't change very fast. They were pretty laid back. If you look at today a cartoon like SpongeBob, which unfortunately I spend entirely too much time watching, everything moves very fast. The scenes change very fast. They even talk fast. The punchlines are reached much more quickly. And this is to appeal to a generation that is used to getting their information much more quickly than we were when we grew up. A couple more points for millennials. Focusing less on credentials. They're much more educated. They're not as impressed by pedigrees of witnesses. They're more focused upon whether someone comes across as smart and likable. I want to skip to the third point really quick, explaining the issues of reliability of evidence. They take for granted that the information that's on the internet is reliable. Oftentimes, I think we all know it is not. And so you may need to slow down your presentation to really focus in on a document that you think is not particularly reliable, but it has still made its way in front of the jury. And just to jump ahead, if you take no point away from my presentation other than this one, I've done my job. I think this quote really sums up the changes that we are experiencing. These jurors are just not going to sit and listen for days and hours and weeks of laborious speaking. If we want to win over the millennials that are increasingly going to be in our jury box, we have got to provide information that is entertaining, gets to the point, and is as interactive as we possibly can make it. Thank you.